Sometimes fate disguises itself as a bargain. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains as Robert arrived at the small office of the registry office. His boots clattered on the worn wooden floor as he approached the table where the clerk waited with the documents. 50 cents. It was all she had in her pocket, and it was exactly the price the widow had asked for the abandoned ranch. The clerk looked at the coins suspiciously. I had never seen anyone buy an entire property for so little money, but the papers were in order, Mrs. Thompson's signature was legitimate, and the law made no distinction between 50 cents and $50 when it came to a legal sale. Robert signed his name carefully. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, trembled slightly. It wasn't nervousness, it was expectation. For months, he had watched that abandoned ranch, its broken fences and its main house with empty windows like dead eyes. But there was something about that place that called him, a feeling he couldn't explain. The property was 5 miles from the city, at the end of a dirt road that weather and rains had made nearly impassable. When Robert first arrived there as the new owner, the silence was absolute. Not even the birds seemed interested in landing on those lands. He walked the grounds with measured steps, surveying each building. The main house needed urgent repairs. The corral was in ruins. But it was when he arrived at the barn that something caught his attention differently. The barn was larger than expected, built with solid wood that had stood the test of time better than the rest of the structures. But there was one detail that immediately intrigued him. 3 heavy padlocks locked the main door. New, shiny padlocks, completely different from the general state of abandonment of the place. Robert tried to peer through the cracks between the boards, but the darkness inside was complete. He went around the barn looking for other entrances, but found only solid wood, without a single opening but the locked door. When he returned to the city that afternoon, he looked for Mrs. Thompson. She was sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, her eyes lost in the distance, as if she saw something no one else could see. He asked about the barn, about the padlocks, about what was inside that needed to be kept locked up for so long. Mrs. Thompson stopped swaying. His fingers tightened the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was only a harsh whisper. She said her husband had locked that barn 20 years ago, just days before he died. She said that he had made her swear that he would never allow anyone to enter there, not even herself, especially herself. Robert noticed that the widow's hands trembled when she talked about it. There was fear in his eyes, but also something else, something that seemed like guilt. He returned to the ranch that evening, carrying only a blanket and some provisions. He decided that he would sleep in the main house, even with its cracked walls and leaky ceiling. But before settling down, he walked once more to the barn. In the light of the full moon, the padlocks shone like small headlights. Robert ran his fingers over the cold metal, feeling the weight of each one. They were expensive padlocks, the kind used to protect valuable things or dangerous. The night wind made the barn's wood creak strangely. It wasn't the normal sound that old wood makes when it cools down. It was different, almost as if something inside was moving. Robert pushed that thought away. They were just the normal sounds of an old building. But when he finally managed to fall asleep that first night, his dreams were populated by images of dark tunnels and the distant sound of metal being dragged over stone. The next morning, he woke up with absolute certainty. He would find out what was in that barn. It didn't matter what the cost. It didn't matter what he found inside. Sometimes fate disguises itself as a bargain, and sometimes 50 cents can buy more mystery than $1,000 could explain. Robert spent the next 3 days repairing what he could in the main house, but his eyes always turned to the barn. It was as if that construction exerted a magnetic force on him, pulling his attention even when he tried to concentrate on other tasks. On the 4th day, he decided he needed answers. He returned to the city with a specific purpose, to find someone who knew the real history of the Thompson family. The barber was his first stop. Old men always knew more than they appeared, and Samuel Hawkins had been cutting hair in that town for 40 years. When Robert mentioned the Thompson Ranch, the man stopped sharpening his razor. Samuel said that William Thompson had arrived in the region in the 70s, coming from the east with his wife and very little money. He bought the land when it was worth almost nothing, but in a few years he had built one of the most prosperous ranches in the region. Fat cattle, verdant fields, enough money to constantly expand. But then came that winter of '82, the winter that almost killed half of the cattle in the region. All the farmers lost money, all except William Thompson. Somehow he not only survived but prospered even more. Robert asked how this was possible. Samuel lowered his voice and said that no one knew for sure, but there were rumors. Rumors about Thompson taking overnight trips to places no one else knew. Rumors about him coming back with heavy saddlebags when he should be coming back empty-handed. After that conversation, Robert reached out to other old residents. The story that emerged was always the same. William Thompson had found some secret source of wealth, something he kept hidden from everyone, including his own wife. When Robert returned to the ranch that afternoon, he surveyed the grounds with different eyes. He looked for signs of ancient excavation, trails leading nowhere, any clues about Thompson's mysterious nocturnal travels. It was then that he noticed something strange on the ground around the barn. The earth there was more compact than on the rest of the property, as if heavy vehicles had passed through it repeatedly over the years. But the marks did not lead to the main road. They were heading in the opposite direction, to the rocky hills behind the property. Robert followed these marks, erased by time. They climbed up a narrow path between the rocks, zigzagging so that they were hidden from any casual observer. After half an hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared into rocky terrain, where it was not possible to leave marks. When he went back down to the ranch, the sun was already setting. But this time, instead of avoiding the barn, Robert decided to take a closer look. He walked around the structure again, paying attention to every detail. It was then that he realized something he had missed before. On the north side of the barn, close to the floor, was a plank that didn't line up perfectly with the others. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Robert knelt down and examined the board more closely. It appeared to have been removed and replaced several times. There were small scratches on the metal of the nails, signs that someone had used tools there repeatedly. Carefully, he managed to unclip the board. Behind it was an empty space, large enough for a person to crawl through. The air that came out of there carried a strange smell, damp earth mixed with something metallic. Robert lit a match and peered through the opening. The dim light revealed the inside of the barn, but it wasn't what he expected to see. Instead of farm tools or stored hay, there was only a rammed earth floor and, in the center, a circular opening covered with thick planks. He managed to squeeze through the opening and enter the barn. Inside, the silence was even deeper than outside. His footsteps seemed to echo strangely, as if there was a much larger space under his feet. The planks that covered the central opening were heavy, but Robert was able to move them. Underneath was a wooden staircase that descended into complete darkness. The metallic smell grew stronger, and now he could identify what it was: the smell of mineral-rich earth. Robert went down only a few steps, holding the match above his head. The light revealed the walls of a tunnel dug into the rock, reinforced with wooden beams. It was not an amateur construction. Someone had invested time and technical knowledge in that project. When the match went out, Robert quickly climbed back to the barn. His hands trembled slightly as he put the planks back in place. He had found William Thompson's secret, but he still didn't know exactly what it meant. That night, while trying to sleep in the main house, Robert couldn't get what he had seen out of his head. The tunnel was clearly very old, but well maintained. Someone had taken care of him over the years. Someone who knew exactly what was down there. And for the first time since he had bought the ranch, Robert began to understand why Mrs. Thompson had sold the property for 50 cents. Some things were cheap, not because they had no value, but because they cost more than anyone was willing to pay. Robert spent the entire night awake, planning how he would explore the tunnel properly. When the sun rose, he was prepared with a flashlight borrowed from the town's blacksmith, ropes, and basic tools. This time, as he descended the wooden staircase, Robert was able to see much more. The tunnel stretched for at least 50 meters in the direction of the hills, just as he had suspected. The walls were carefully excavated and reinforced, showing the work of someone who understood mining. As he went, Robert noticed details that confirmed his suspicions. There were narrow rails on the tunnel floor, the kind used to transport mine trucks. The walls showed marks from digging tools, and the air grew progressively cooler, suggesting that there was natural ventilation further ahead. After about 10 minutes of walking through the tunnel, Robert came to a natural cave. His flashlight illuminated a much larger space than he expected, an underground chamber that extended beyond the reach of light. But it wasn't the size of the cave that made Robert stop and hold his breath. That's what was on the walls. Golden veins flowed through the rock like glistening rivers frozen in time. They weren't just little nuggets or traces. They were thick, rich veins that extended in various directions through the natural rock. Robert had found one of the richest gold mines he had ever seen in his life. Now it all made sense. William Thompson's sudden prosperity, your mysterious night travels. The reason he had locked the barn so carefully and made his wife swear that he would never let anyone in. Robert examined the cave in more detail. There was evidence of recent work, abandoned tools, piles of broken rock, even a minecart partially loaded with gold ore. William Thompson had been working in this mine until shortly before he died. But there was something more disturbing. Near one of the walls, Robert found ancient bones. Human bones, partially buried under loose stones. It wasn't a complete skeleton, but they were clearly the remains of someone who had passed away in that cave long ago. Robert examined the bones carefully. They looked very old, covered in a thin layer of golden dust that had accumulated over the years. Whoever that person was had found their final resting place in this hidden mine. Next to the bones, half buried in the earth, Robert found something that made his heart race. A sheriff's star, so old that the metal had darkened almost completely, but it was still possible to read the engraved name, Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Robert recalled the stories he had heard about a law enforcement officer who had disappeared in the area about 25 years ago. At the time, everyone thought that he had gotten lost in the mountains, or that he had simply decided to quit his job and head into uncharted territory. But the truth was different. Deputy Bradley had discovered William Thompson's secret mine, and somehow he had ended up losing his life in this cave, taking the secret with him to the grave. Robert sat on a rock, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. It wasn't just a gold mine. It was the place where a man had met his end, and now he was the only one who knew the truth about what had really happened in that cave decades ago. The wealth around him was tempting. The veins of gold on the walls were worth more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, but there was a dark story attached to that gold. The story of a lawman who had disappeared forever, leaving only questions unanswered. Robert looked at the sheriff's star in his hands. Tom Bradley had lost himself trying to find out the truth, and Mrs. Thompson, she knew. Maybe not the details, but I knew there was something disturbing about that barn. That is why he had sold the property for 50 cents. That's why she had made her husband swear that he would never let anyone in. She was getting rid of not just one property. She was shedding the weight of a secret that had plagued her for decades. Robert put the star in his pocket and began to walk back through the tunnel. His mind worked quickly, weighing his options. He could simply pretend that he had never found the cave. He could work the mine in secret, as Thompson had done. He could become rich beyond his wildest dreams. But every time she thought about it, she felt the weight of Deputy Bradley's star in her pocket. Some secrets were too heavy to carry alone. Some riches came with a price that went beyond money. As he emerged from the barn, the midday sun blinded him momentarily. The normal world seemed strangely bright and noisy after the deep silence of the cave. Robert carefully locked the secret entrance and walked back to the main house. He had an important decision to make, and he knew that whatever he chose, it would change not only his life, but also determine the fate of the remains of an honest man who had disappeared decades ago, searching for the truth. Robert spent 3 days without returning to the cave. He stayed in the main house, repairing tiles and painting walls, trying to keep his hands busy as his mind struggled with the decision he needed to make. But Deputy Bradley's star seemed to burn in his pocket, constantly reminding him of the secret he now carried. On the 4th day, he could no longer resist. He returned to the city, but this time with a different purpose. He looked up old records, old newspapers, any information about Tom Bradley's disappearance. In the town library, in yellowed copies of the local newspaper, Robert found the full story. Tom Bradley had arrived in the region in 1881, sent by the territorial government to investigate rumors of illegal activity in the mines in the area. He was young, determined, and known for his absolute honesty. The last record on Bradley was dated from December 1882. The newspaper mentioned that the deputy had left for a routine investigation and had never returned. A search was organized, but they never found even his horse. Robert closed the paper with trembling hands. The dates coincided perfectly with the period when William Thompson had mysteriously begun to prosper. The deputy had gotten closer to the truth, and somehow he had ended up buried in that cave, along with the secret he was trying to unravel. When he returned to the ranch that afternoon, Robert made his decision. He couldn't just ignore what he had discovered. Tom Bradley deserved better than to be forgotten at the bottom of a mine, even after so many years. Robert carefully prepared for what he needed to do. He descended into the cave again, this time carrying suitable tools and a sturdy canvas bag. The work was difficult and respectful. He carefully gathered all of Mr. Bradley's bones, along with his star and some personal belongings he had found scattered around the cave. As he worked, Robert noticed something else. There were signs that the mine was not completely abandoned. Some tools seemed to have been used recently, and there were fresh footprints in the golden dust on the ground. Someone else knew about that place. This discovery made Robert speed up his work. If someone else knew the secret of the mine, he needed to act quickly. He finished gathering the remains of the deputy and left the cave carrying the bag with extreme care. Robert decided that he would take Tom Bradley's remains to the city cemetery and ensure that the man had a proper burial. But first, he needed official help. The next morning, he went to the town's current sheriff, an elderly man named Marcus Webb. Sheriff Webb listened to Robert's story with growing incredulity. When Robert placed the tarnished star on the office desk, the sheriff's eyes widened. He took the piece reverently, carefully wiping away the blackened metal. Webb said he had met Tom Bradley in person when he was just a young MP. Bradley had been his mentor, the man who had taught him about justice and integrity. The disappearance of the deputy had been one of the great mysteries of the region, something that had tormented him for decades. Robert took the sheriff to the ranch and showed him the secret entrance to the barn. Together, they went down to the cave. Webb was silent for a long time when he saw the veins of gold on the walls and the place where the remains had been found. The sheriff confirmed what Robert already suspected. This was one of the richest mines he had ever seen. The gold there was worth a fortune, easily enough to make any man rich for life. But it also confirmed that William Thompson had taken his secret to the grave, leaving only clues and consequences. Webb said he would open an official investigation into the case. Even after so many years, Tom Bradley's remains would be examined properly and then given a dignified burial in the town cemetery, with all the honors due to an officer of the law. But then came the question Robert knew would be asked: what did he intend to do with the mine? Robert looked around the golden cave. The wealth was there, waiting for him. He could mine the gold, sell the property for thousands of dollars, live comfortably for the rest of his life. That is what any sensible person would do. But when he touched Deputy Bradley's star in his pocket, Robert knew what his response would be. Some things were more important than money. Some discoveries came with responsibilities that could not be ignored. He told the sheriff he wanted to do the right thing. I wanted the truth about Tom Bradley to be known. He wanted the deputy to be remembered as the honest man he had been, not as a mysterious disappeared. Sheriff Webb smiled for the first time since they had descended into the cave. He said Tom Bradley would have been proud to know that, even after so many years, there were still men willing to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. When they came out of the cave that afternoon, Robert knew his life had changed forever. Not in the way he had imagined when he bought the ranch for 50 cents, but in a much more meaningful way. He had found not only gold, but also the opportunity to restore dignity to a man who deserved it. Representative Tom Bradley's funeral took place on a clear spring morning. 25 years after his death, the whole city attended. Men who had been children when Bradley disappeared came to pay their respects. Women who barely remembered him brought flowers. The pastor spoke about delayed justice and how the truth always finds a way to emerge, even after decades of being buried. Robert was present, holding his hat in his hands, watching as the deputy's remains finally found their proper rest. Bradley's star had been polished and placed over the coffin, shining in the morning sun as a symbol of restored honor. After the funeral, Sheriff Webb sought out Robert. He had completed his investigation and discovered more details about Bradley's last days. The deputy had been investigating several illegal mines in the region, but Thompson's mine was by far the largest and most profitable he had found. Webb had also discovered something important in the old records. The mine was not technically legal. Thompson had never properly registered the mining rights, which meant that the gold still belonged to the territory. But there was an interesting clause in the law. Anyone who discovered an abandoned mine and reported it to the authorities was entitled to a significant percentage of the value. Robert could claim 30% of everything extracted from the mine, an amount that would still make him very rich. But he had made a different decision. Instead of accepting the money for himself, Robert proposed something unprecedented. He wanted his share of the proceeds to be used to create a memorial fund for Reppers Tom Bradley, a fund that would help families of law enforcement officials who lost their providers in the line of duty. The proposal caused a commotion in the city. No one had ever seen anyone turn down a fortune of this magnitude to honor the memory of a man they had not even met personally. But Robert knew it was the right thing to do. Sheriff Webb was so impressed with the gesture that he offered Robert a job as a deputy. He said that the city needed men with this kind of character, men who put justice above personal profit. Robert accepted the offer. During the next few months, while the mine was legally organized and began operating under territorial supervision, he learned the responsibilities of being a law enforcement officer. He wore the same star that once belonged to Tom Bradley, polished and shiny again. Mrs. Thompson sought out Robert a few weeks after the funeral. She had heard about his decision to give up the fortune and wanted to thank him personally. He confessed that he had lived with guilt all those years, knowing that something terrible had happened in that barn, but too afraid to find out the truth. She said she could finally sleep peacefully, knowing that Tom Bradley had received the justice he deserved, even if belatedly. As a sign of gratitude, she insisted on returning the 50 cents Robert had paid for the ranch, saying that he had given far more than he received. Robert kept the 2 coins as a souvenir. Sometimes when he faced difficult decisions in his job as a congressman, he would hold the coins and remember how 50 cents had changed not only his life, but also brought justice to a forgotten man. The Tom Bradley Memorial Fund grew rapidly. The community, inspired by Robert's example, contributed generously. Within a few years, the fund had helped dozens of families and become one of the region's most respected legacies. Robert continued to live on the ranch, which now served as his base of operations. He repaired the main house, repaired the fences, and turned the place into a proper home. The barn was converted into a small headquarters for the charitable fund's activities, but the entrance to the mine was permanently sealed after the completion of extraction operations. Years later, when people asked Robert if he regretted giving up a fortune in gold, he always gave the same answer. He said that he had found something far more valuable than gold in that cave. He had found the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others and to honor the memory of a good man. On quiet nights, when the wind blew through the mountains and made the wood of the house creak softly, Robert sometimes thought of Tom Bradley. I imagined the congressman walking down those same corridors 25 years ago, determined to do the right thing, even though he knew the risks. The star on Robert's chest shone with the same integrity that had once guided Tom Bradley. And he knew that wherever the deputy was now, he was proud to see his star being carried by someone who understood that true wealth is not measured in gold, but in the difference we make in other people's lives. 50 cents had bought a ranch, but the choice to do what was right had bought something far more precious, the peace of mind that comes from knowing that when life offers us a choice between profit and integrity, there is always a correct answer. And sometimes that answer is worth more than all the gold in the world.